We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. Until the killing of
we are here, and here we are likely to be. To imagine that we shall ever be eradicated is absurd and ridiculous. We repeat, therefore, that we are here and that this is our country. We deem it a settled point that the destiny of the colored man is bound up with that of the white people of this country. We shall neither die out or be driven out, but shall go with this people either as a testimony against them or as evidence in their favor.
That which touches me most is that I had a chance to work with people.
Frederick Douglass was there to challenge America, to question America about its mission, to question America about its Constitution, to question America about its very independence.
From Douglass, I've learned more than from anyone else that to understand a notion like freedom, one has to understand its denials. One has to understand the way it has been obstructed in order to understand the way it's found.
They tell the story that a student came to see him near the end of his life, and the student asked him, "What should I do with my life?" And they tell the story that Douglass said, pulled himself up to his great height and said, "Agitate, agitate, agitate."
Echo. Nothing but an echo of the past.
The Africans and the descendants of Africans sleep here, under the trees in graves hidden from history. In life, they were valued as property, inventoried in careful lists. In death, they were judged not worthy of a record, a mystery even unto themselves. With no markers, no names, no dates of birth and death.
The birth date of a slave was unimportant. And for many slaves, not knowing when you were born is like not really ever being able to shed bondage.
Born a slave, Frederick Douglass told the story of his life in 3 autobiographies and in hundreds of speeches, all working for the freedom of a people in bondage and ensuring that the details of their daily lives would never be forgotten.
I have never met with a slave who could tell me how old he was. Few slave mothers know anything of the months of the year, nor of the days of the month. They measure the ages of their children by springtime, wintertime, harvest time, planting time. Like other slaves, I cannot tell how old I am. My master allowed no questions to be put to him by which a slave could learn his age.
Knowing who you are, knowing where you came from, knowing your birth date, has to do with knowing your individual identity. For Douglass, knowing his birth date meant knowing who Douglass was, who Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was.
Here, Douglass spent the final years of his life. in the house he named Cedar Hill, across the river from Washington, D.C. On a spring morning in 1894, a year before his death, he recorded the last entry in his diary. He described a trip to Baltimore to visit a relative of his old slave master. He was still in search of his birth date, a matter Douglas called a serious trouble.
I called yesterday while in Baltimore upon Dr. Thomas Sears and learned the following fact. Captain Aaron Anthony died November 14, 1823.
Working with the recorded death of his slave master, Douglas figured his own birth date as February 1817. But he was wrong. Years after Douglas died, the truth about the birth of the slave Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was discovered in a plantation ledger. Next to his slave name was the date, February 1818.
And I suspect this search for an accurate birth date became a kind of obsession, in part because this was somebody who was always telling his own story and always trying to understand, I suspect, even within himself, how he got from there to here.
I am sitting here wanting memories to teach me to see the beauty.
The first experience of life with me that I now remember began in the family of my grandmother and grandfather. My grandmother enjoyed the high privilege of living in a cabin with no other burden but then her support and the necessary care of the little children. Living here with my dear old grandmother and grandfather, it was a long time before I knew myself to be a slave.
His grandmother is someone who interprets the world for him and helps him to understand what he sees. Her faith in him, her confidence in him, her sense that he is meant to be something very important is a part of that necessary building of himself.
The woman who had taught him so much spared him the hard facts of his future as a slave, that someday soon he would be claimed as property by the man called Old Master and forced to live and work on a great plantation.
When the time of my departure was decided upon, my grandmother, knowing my fears and in pity of them, kindly kept me ignorant of the dreaded event. She led me along by the hand, resisting with the reserve and solemnity of a priestess all my inquiring looks to the last. She was soon to lose another object of affection, as she had lost many before. I knew she was unhappy, and the shadow fell from her brow on me.
Frederick was turned over to Old Master, Aaron Anthony, manager of one of the largest plantations on the eastern shore. Y Plantation covered almost 10,000 acres, included 13 farms, and a workforce of more than 500 slaves.
The Y Plantation was completely self-sufficient, and that self-sufficiency depended on black hands. The blacksmiths, the carpenters, the people who worked in the fields, the coachmen, the cooks, the maids, the butlers. Everything that was done on the Y Plantation was done by black hands.
In the world into which Frederick Douglass was born, slavery was a time-honored American institution 200 years old. More than 1 million Africans and African Americans like himself were considered property. They were bought and sold and were bred like cattle.
Lord, you
Harriet Bailey saw her fourth child, Frederick, only when she could manage to walk the 24-mile round trip from the fields of a neighboring farm to Y Plantation after her long work day.
His mother represents what a terrible thing slavery can do to a family, to a community. But his mother, of course, also represents what a beautiful thing it is for a mother to determine to see her son, whatever she has to do to make that possible.
Frederick's mother died before he was 9 years old. He later wrote, her grave was like those lost at sea, without a marker or a stake. She died, he said, never revealing the identity of his father.
It could be the case that Douglas's father was an unknown man. He could have been an overseer. He could have been a white man who worked for the family that Harriet Bailey worked for, because as far as sexuality was concerned, in the white South, it was open season on black women. And that tragedy is something that haunted Douglas as well.
Slavery does away with fathers as it does away with families. The name of the child is not expected to be that of his father. He may be white, glorying in the purity of his Anglo-Saxon blood, and his child may be ranked with the blackest of slaves. Indeed, he may be, and often is, master to the same child.
Douglas would later write that slavery had made his mother a myth and his father a mystery.
A little nearer to my old masters stood a very long, rough, low building, literally alive with slaves of all ages, conditions, and sizes. They would sometimes sing. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. To those songs, I trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery.
And Douglas saw firsthand the cruelty of slavery. He saw his Aunt Hester beaten cruelly. He saw one slave who waded out into the water to get away from the overseer's lash, simply shot in the head for that. So Douglas gives us firsthand our most graphic picture of what bondage does to the human spirit.
As I grew older and more thoughtful, I was more and more filled with a sense of my wretchedness. The terrible reports of wrong and outrage which came to my ear, together with what I almost daily witnessed, led me, but when 8 or 9 years old, to wish I had never been born.
In the summer of 1826, Frederick was sent north across the Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore to work for Hugh Auld and his wife, Sophia. For the rest of his life, he would think of himself as chosen, not by chance, not by luck, but by divine providence. In the home of Sophia Auld, young Frederick was no longer treated as property, but treated as a child. He slept in a bed for the first time, took meals with the family, and was encouraged to speak his mind.
Well, from Sophia Auld, his mistress in Baltimore at about the age of 10, he receives the gift of words. She teaches him his letters. And for about a year, he is given the freedom to read and continue to inscribe in his booklets. But after about a year, his master Hewald, her husband, discovers this, in part because it's the law that you are not to teach slaves to read and write, and in part, I suspect, because Hewald was threatened by that. Hewald laid down the law and declared that Douglas shall not be taught to read and write.
Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. If you learn him how to read, he'll want to know how to write. And this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself.
And Douglas later on referred to that as the first anti-slavery lecture he ever heard, because Hewald's analysis was absolutely on target. He was describing what would eventually kill off slavery. It would be when black people came to have the power to articulate their grievances.
When forbidden to read in the Auld home, Frederick carried a Webster's spelling book into the streets, asking help from his white friends, bribing them with food when he had to. Letter by letter, he mastered the rest of the alphabet, and by age 12 had learned to read and write.
Eventually, he got himself into a bookstore and bought the Columbian Orator, that most important of all books in his life. He would go down behind the warehouses, somewhere all by himself, and really that's how he taught himself to be an orator. He just memorized those speeches.
Douglas, from that point on, was just in love with words, in love with reading. He had books in his pocket, pieces of paper in his pocket, and he read everywhere everything he could possibly read.
As I read, behold, the very discontent so graphically predicted by Master Auld had come upon me. Knowledge had come, light had penetrated the moral dungeon where I dwelt.
A 150 miles south of Baltimore, a slave named Nat Turner turned the written word into a sword. Preaching that passages from the Bible foretold rebellion, he led a band of slaves against the town of Jerusalem, Virginia, killing 57 white men, women, and children before he was captured and hanged. In the aftermath, Southern states passed even stricter laws against slaves learning to read or becoming ministers or holding prayer meetings out of the sight of white people.
What happens when you have a rebellion like Nat Turner's rebellion is that the entire countryside, indeed the entire South, is up in arms. And every black man, woman, and child is a target. And the repression is immense. There is death, there is torture, there is fear, there is suspicion. Every black is a rebel.
In 1831, the same year that Nat Turner marched on Virginia, young Frederick experienced his own religious conversion.
While thus religiously seeking knowledge, I became acquainted with an old colored man named Lawson. He fanned my already intense love of knowledge into a flame by assuring me that I was to be a useful man in the world. When I would ask him, how can these things be? His simple reply was, trust in the Lord.
It is this Father Lawson who identifies for Douglas, in a sense, a deep piece of his calling, to take the spoken word and the written word and to meld them together into a great weapon on behalf of freedom.
At age 15, Frederick Bailey was ordered back to Y Plantation. His new master, Thomas Auld, wanted him hired out as a field hand and sent him to work for Edward Covey, a farmer with a reputation for breaking difficult slaves.
What we've got here now with Douglas living with Edward Covey is a teenage slave who is not only disobedient, but is in despair. He's clearly a very thoughtful young man at this point, but he has seen the rest of his life. And he's seen that the rest of his life may mean that he's a field hand.
He almost broke Douglas. He worked him night and day, and he threatened him and used words of intimidation and violence, and Douglas was on the edge of being broken and on the edge of being made into a meek and humble slave.
It was the whip, the sting of the lash that Covey used to control young Frederick. But after 6 months of beatings and work in Covey's fields, Frederick decided to be beaten no more.
Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know, I resolved to fight. This battle with Mr. Covey was a turning point in my career as a slave. It revived within me a sense of my own manhood. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me.
Covey never reported the incident, probably to protect his own reputation as a Negro breaker. At year's end, the teenager was hired out to another farm, where he organized 20 or 30 young men into a secret school. Using the same speller and Columbian orator he had carried from Baltimore, he began the dangerous and illegal work of teaching other slaves to read and to plan for escape.
Douglas is living parallel with Nat Turner. In many ways, he is a marked man because he's living now in a South that has been highly sensitized to the charismatic leader, to the preacher of the word, to the teacher who takes the biblical word and transforms it into something that the slave-owning community never intended.
In the secrecy of the woods, Frederick and 5 other slaves met every Sunday. There they planned an escape across the Chesapeake, but were betrayed and thrown into jail. Townspeople called for the teenager to be hanged and burned, or like Nat Turner, skinned and displayed. It was Frederick who could read and write. Frederick who had written the passes. The pressure to get rid of him fell on his owner, Thomas Auld.
His wife was after him to sell him south. His father-in-law was after him to, get a dangerous slave out of here and sell him away into the deep south. And Thomas Auld doesn't do it. He sends him to Baltimore.
Frederick again felt some power had interceded in his life. Instead of death or the cruel life of a Mississippi field hand, he was hired out to work in a shipyard. But his mind was still fixed on freedom.
To plan an escape, one had to be extremely careful, and one needed a lot of good friends. One needed to be cunning, crafty, careful. One needed good disguises. Mostly one needed a great deal of courage.
No man can tell the intense agony which is felt by the slave when wavering on the point of making his escape. All that he has is at stake, and even that which he has not is at stake also. The life which he has may be lost, and the liberty which he seeks may not be gained.
You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right.
In Baltimore, Frederick met Anna Murray, a free black woman from the eastern shore of Maryland who worked as a housekeeper and used her savings to help with his escape.
You got a right to the tree of life.
Working closely with a secret society that aided fugitive slaves, Frederick devised a careful plan. He would disguise himself as a sailor, using travel papers borrowed from a free seaman. He would travel by train to Havre de Grace, Maryland, then cross the Susquehanna by ferry, take another train to Wilmington, Delaware, and finally board a steamboat to Philadelphia. On September 3rd, 1838, Frederick Bailey, carrying his copy of the Columbian Orator, crossed into freedom. Once he was free, Frederick and Anna were married.
You got a right to the tree of life.
The couple traveled north to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a Quaker town with a large fugitive population. There, to avoid the attention of slave catchers, he chose a new last name. From Sir Walter Scott's book, Lady of the Lake, Frederick Bailey became Frederick Douglass.
I think at that point Douglass felt secure, felt relatively safe, because he's living in a community with a large number of fugitive slaves, with an abolitionist tradition, and he probably wanted to remain an essentially private man.
In 4 or 5 months after reaching New Bedford, there came a young man to me with a copy of The Liberator, the paper edited by William Lloyd Garrison. The Liberator was a paper after my own heart. It detested slavery, it preached human brotherhood, denounced oppression, and demanded the complete emancipation of my race. I not only liked, I loved this paper and its editor.
Garrison, president of the American Anti-Slavery Society, was an uncompromising radical who publicly burned copies of the U.S. Constitution while denouncing it as a pro-slavery document. The Garrisonians invited Douglass to the Abolitionist Convention at the Athenaeum in Nantucket. There, Douglass was asked to tell his story of bondage to freedom.
I was induced to speak out the feelings inspired by the occasion and the fresh recollections of the scenes through which I had passed as a slave. It was with the utmost difficulty that I could stand erect, or that I could command and articulate 2 words without hesitation and stammering. I trembled in every limb.
Moved by Douglass's depiction of slave life, Garrison asked him to become a full-time lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society. Despite the risk in publicly identifying himself as a fugitive slave, Douglass joined the Garrisonians, crisscrossing New England to tell his story.
That relationship with Garrison and this band of radical moralist abolitionists becomes, in a sense, the anti-slavery church, the anti-slavery family in which Frederick Douglass found his feet and found his voice, found his own kind of critique of slavery and of America, that he now would be hired to go out and practice on the abolitionist circuit week in and week out.
Many came, no doubt from curiosity, to hear what a Negro could say in his own cause. I was generally introduced as a chattel, a thing, a piece of Southern property. The chairman assuring the crowd that it could speak.
Here's this 24-year-old man just out of slavery, standing on the platform, tall, erect, with his great voice and his great presence, taking his audiences to Slave Row. And he can make them see and feel the sweat and the color and the pain and the joy and the tears of Slave Row. The audiences all over the country recognized that here was a master who could reveal slavery in a way that nobody had ever done before.
Everyone wanted to hear the Frederick Douglass story. The burden of that, of course, is that he had to be a symbol. He had to be somehow the slave come to flesh, the slave come to life. In a sense, he had to stand there and demonstrate his pain publicly.
Douglass had to contend with an America that viewed descendants of Africa as inferior beings, 3/5 a person, not worthy of equal participation in the society. Traveling New England, he was denied seats on trains, tables in restaurants, rooms in hotels.
Douglass and the other black abolitionists had to fight Jim Crow in the North as well as slavery in the South. And having to wage this twin struggle, I think gave them a greater sense and a greater feeling for the depth of the racial problem in America.
Let us have the facts, said the people. We will take care of the philosophy. Be yourself and tell your story. Better to have a little of the plantation manner of speech than not. 'Tis not best you seem too learned. I could not always obey, for I was now reading and thinking. It did not entirely satisfy me to narrate wrongs. I felt like denouncing them. I was growing and needed room.
He particularly resented it when they thought he ought to sound more simple. He ought to sound more like a darky. He was not about to sound any way other than the way he wanted to sound. He wanted to speak elegantly. He knew how to speak elegantly, and he was going to do so, and did.
At last, the apprehended trouble came. People doubted if I had ever been a slave. They said I did not talk like a slave, look like a slave, nor act like a slave, and that they believed I had never been south of the Mason and Dixon line.
In 1845, Douglass published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. Risking recapture, he used real names, real places to authenticate his journey from slavery to freedom.
Those who could write, those who could wield words, those who could tell their own history were authentic people. Those who had a history were authentic people. Now, Douglass had been doing that on platforms, but now he could put it on paper. He could take it out and say, here's my story, read it.
To tell that story means to put yourself at great risk, because you are now proclaiming to the world that you have broken the laws of the nation, that you are, according to the American constitutional law, you are contraband. And you are proclaiming it from the housetops. And you are therefore in danger.
The Anti-Slavery Society, concerned for Douglass's safety and interested in capitalizing on his popularity, arranged for a speaking tour overseas. Douglass sailed for Britain in August 1845. Remaining behind in Lynn, Massachusetts, were his 4 children and his wife, Anna.
My dear friend Garrison, one of the most pleasing features of my visit thus far has been a total absence of all manifestations of prejudice against me. I go on stagecoaches, steamships, into the first cabins. I find myself not treated as a color, but as a man. In great haste, ever yours, Frederick Douglass.
The people of England were just overwhelmed by Douglass. And lords and ladies and aristocratic people flocked to his lectures and tried to get close to him and to talk to him because they were just tremendously impressed by what he was.
Before British audiences, Douglass waged war on American hypocrisy, condemning America's founding fathers and institutions for supporting slavery. As news of his speeches reached the United States, the American press condemned him, calling him a paid extremist.
I am aware that the wisdom of exposing the sins of one nation in the ear of another has been seriously questioned by good and clear-sighted people. However, the system of slavery is such a giant sin, so destructive to the moral sense, that I feel not only at liberty but abundantly justified in appealing to the whole world to aid in its removal.
He was not a voice, he was not a presence that any particular reform movement could easily control. And I think it was in England that he found this new independence, and it's indeed his British friends who actually buy his freedom for him, his legal freedom. And that, I think, is where this quest for an independent public career probably began.
His British friends paid Thomas Auld £150 for the freedom of his slave named Frederick Bailey. Many of Douglas's closest allies attacked him for trafficking with slaveholders. But he responded by saying that his freedom was worth more than the price paid. At age 29, after almost 2 years in exile, Douglas returned to the United States, a free man and an international celebrity. Anna Douglas had made a home for her family in Lynn, Massachusetts for 6 years. But soon after her husband's return from Europe, he announced his intention to move to Rochester, New York, and start a newspaper.
It must have been extremely difficult for Anna Marie as a wife and as a mother. She was fettered because she was not a reader and a writer. So as he moved into the world that revolved around text and revolved around publishing and revolved around a kind of gentlemanly presentation, she could only keep up with part of that.
Douglas started his 4-page weekly with the help of $2,500 raised by his British friends. Garrison, the editor of The Liberator, saw Douglas's newspaper as competition and discouraged him from publishing it.
There were times when I almost thought my Boston friends were right in dissuading me from my newspaper project. But under the circumstances, it was the best school possible for me. It obliged me to think and read. It made it necessary for me to lean upon myself and not upon the heads of our anti-slavery church, to be a principal, not an agent.
This is a movement to free slaves, and former slaves, fugitive slaves, and free African Americans ought to be in the vanguard of that movement. And so a black voice was crucial as a vanguard voice because this was, in essence, a black struggle. And Douglas, because of his popularity, because of his skills, was best able to fill that.
Douglas is a phenomenon that deeply affects the anti-slavery movement in this country, because he simply comes on the scene and bursts like a great star to which everything else must now reposition itself.
From the beginning, Douglas's North Star took bold positions on issues of class and race and gender. In 1848, he came out strongly for the right of women to have the vote.
The abolitionist movement, before it became a movement that influential white males were involved in, was a movement that white women had advocated. So Douglas very shrewdly capitalized on that. That was part of the reason he moved to Rochester, because there was a very strong abolitionist center there, and that center was female.
In respect to political rights, we hold woman to be justly entitled to all we claim for man. There can be no reason in the world for denying to woman the exercise of the elective franchise. Our doctrine is that right is of no sex.
By the end of the 1840s, Douglas no longer spoke for the Garrisonians. He was now the voice of his people. He attacked plans to return black people to Africa, called for political action to end slavery, and in a speech in Boston, he made it clear that he no longer shared Garrison's confidence that moral suasion could end slavery.
I should welcome the intelligence tomorrow should it come that the slaves had risen in the South, and that the sable arms which had been engaged in beautifying and adorning the South were engaged in spreading death and devastation.
There's a very rich debate among black abolitionists and white abolitionists by the late 1840s about violence as a tactic, about plans of organized insurrection, if it could be done, about trying to influence party politics, of trying to use the United States Constitution in a radical reading of it as a means of applying pressure to the United States government.
Since rising to speak in Nantucket, he had been loyal to Garrison's interpretation of the U.S. Constitution as a document that protected the property rights of every white American to own slaves. But in 1849, Douglas angered Garrison by announcing that the Constitution's promise of liberty for all should be used to fight slavery. Garrison openly attacked him and removed the North Star from his organization's reading list.
Douglas, by the time of their break, had come to the conclusion that the movement should be black-led. He had come to the conclusion that while the Liberator, Garrison's newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Standard, and the Anti-Slavery Bugle were all very important, that again you needed a black voice. And he was the maker of that voice.
In 1850, Northern and Southern congressmen debated whether the new Western territories would be slave states or free. A compromise was reached. The North succeeded in limiting the expansion of slavery. The South obtained a new fugitive slave law, guaranteeing federal support for owners coming north to retrieve runaways. The new law was written so broadly, it put every black person in danger.
The African American community of the North is in turmoil. And it does literally mean husbands being dragged away from their families, mothers being taken away from their children, whole families being sent south.
Douglas now joins a wave of change among abolitionists because now resistance to slavery becomes self-defense. The use of violence becomes the protection of a fugitive slave escaping through your town.
And it's at that point that Douglas becomes very, very active in the Underground Railroad. And this becomes, aside from his newspaper activities, his most important mission is to get slaves not only out of the South, but out of the South, out of the North, and to Canada.
In the first 3 months after passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, thousands of black men, women, and children from northern states crossed into Canada. In 1852, Douglas was asked to speak in commemoration of the 4th of July. In protest, he spoke on the 5th, calling the 4th White America's Independence Day, a holiday they could rejoice, but he must mourn.
America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds itself to be false to the future. Go where you may, search where you will, roam all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that, for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without arrival.
Those persons who are descendants of Africans who were imported into this country and sold as slaves were not intended to be included under the word citizen in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument allows.
In 1857, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared in the Dred Scott case that a black man had no rights in an American court of law, and no rights which the white man was bound to respect. He also decided that the U.S. Congress could not restrict the expansion of slavery.
If the fugitive slave law politicized Douglass, Dred Scott radicalized him. Basically, what the decision said was that you're not a citizen, you never will be. You will have to live in this country as a bond person. And this is coming from the highest law in the land, the Constitution. So what else is open to a black man except radical resistance?
Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
In 1859, Frederick Douglass journeyed to a secret meeting place in Pennsylvania, near the Virginia border, to talk with his friend John Brown, a 59-year-old zealot consumed by the idea of destroying slavery. Brown told Douglass of a plan to attack the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, a small town west of Washington, D.C., and to use the captured weapons to arm freed slaves and make war on slaveholders.
John Brown trying to persuade him to come with him, and Douglass arguing against the plan, saying in effect that it was impractical and that it was strategically unwise.
There was evidently something of futility in what John Brown was doing. There was something that told Douglass, this is not going to win. This is not the way.
On October 16th, Brown led 13 white and 5 black volunteers into Harper's Ferry and seized control of the arsenal. After 36 hours of fighting, U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee stormed the building, capturing Brown and a handful of survivors. Brown was quickly tried and convicted of murder, treason, and conspiring with slaves to rebel. On the 2nd day of December, 1859, John Brown was hanged.
Brown was a kind of vanguard, a kind of point man for abolitionists who themselves would never have organized a band of warriors to march into the South, but this man would. He was useful in very real ways to abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, who now dreamed about and wished for some kind of breakup of the American Union.
A letter in Brown's possession implied that Douglass knew in advance about the raid. Governor Wise of Virginia called for his immediate arrest. With U.S. Marshals on his trail, Douglass escaped to Canada and then to England.
We heard from dear father last week, and his grief was great. I trust the next letter will evince more composure of mind.
In England, Douglass received word of the death of his youngest child, Annie. Although still fearful of arrest, he boarded the first steamer back to America to be with Anna and their remaining 4 children.
By this time, luckily, the Congress had decided to try to cool it after the John Brown raid, and decided not to pursue indictments of any possible conspirators. And he comes back into the country, does kind of come back quietly through Maine and across Canada and back down into Rochester.
November 1860. Abraham Lincoln, campaigning on the slogan, "No More Slave States," was elected president. In South Carolina, the Charleston Mercury announced, "The Revolution of 1860 has been initiated." Five months later, in Charleston Harbor, Southern troops opened fire on Fort Sumter. The national argument over slavery was now civil war.
The fate of the greatest of all modern republics trembles in the balance. The lesson of the hour is written down in the characters of blood and fire. We are taught, as with the emphasis of an earthquake, that nations not less than individuals are subjects of the moral government of the universe, and that persistent transgressions of the laws of this divine government will certainly bring national sorrow, shame, suffering, and death. Of all the nations of the world, we seem most in need of this solemn lesson.
War is a horrifying, dirty, nasty, terrible thing. But one has to be clear on this. Douglass welcomed the Civil War. He believed that this was the much prophesied coming of a rending of America in a war that of necessity would have to be made on slavery and on slaveholders.
In editorials, in speeches, in letters, Douglass repeated that the Negro is the key of the situation, the pivot upon which the whole rebellion turns. Douglass challenged President Lincoln to declare this a war to end slavery. But although the president saw slavery as a moral wrong, he believed the real key to peace was the removal of black people from America.
You and we are different races. We have between us a broader difference than exists between almost any other two races. We should be separated. But for your race among us, there could not be war.
Though elected as an anti-slavery man by the Republican and abolitionist voters, Mr. Lincoln is quite a genuine representative of American prejudice and Negro hatred, and far more concerned with the preservation of slavery than the principle of justice and humanity.
Douglass wanted Lincoln and the nation to see slavery as a threat to the liberty of all Americans, white and black. Only then, he believed, would the nation act to end it.
Douglass and many of the abolitionists realized that something is going to come out of this war, and it's going to have to do with the end of slavery. And so they pushed for that. They appealed to Lincoln. They basically bombard Lincoln with petitions. The war has started. Now free the slaves. Now free the slaves. Lincoln is inundated with that demand day and night.
Lincoln feared he would lose popular support for the war if it became a fight to end slavery. But in September 1862, as an act of military necessity, he announced he would issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Although the proclamation did not abolish slavery nationally and freed only slaves in rebel territory, Douglass and many others applauded this major step toward freedom.
There are certain great national acts which by their relation to the universal principles belong to the whole human family. And Abraham Lincoln's proclamation on the 1st of January, 1863, is one of these acts.
If the war indeed was going to take on the issue of slavery, and if the war was being carried out against those who were supporting slavery, then black people ought to have the opportunity to participate as soldiers in the war.
Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his buttons and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned full citizenship in the United States.
We are calling Yankee soldiers who've enlisted for the war.
In the proclamation, Lincoln declared that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. Lincoln needed recruits to save the Union. Douglas needed black men to win their own freedom.
Look there above the center, where the flag is waving bright. We are going out slaving.
The 54th Massachusetts, the organization of this regiment, for which Douglas recruited some 100 members, became the living reality of emancipation. They were the symbols now of a war that was clearly destined to destroy slavery. And it must have been with both great fear and with great pride that Douglas could put his own 2 young sons in that regiment.
I think it was exhilarating for Douglas to see his son as a Union soldier. And I think that was the case with many of the African Americans, especially those who had struggled so long in leadership positions to bring that war to fruition.
In the last years of the Civil War, 179,000 black men fought for their freedom. 38,000 lost their lives. In those same years, Douglas called on the nation to create a new order built on the ashes of the old. An America where the Declaration of Independence was no longer a lie.
Douglas hoped that America might be the place that he could give witness to as a great nation. He saw its possibilities, he saw its potentials, and he was willing to struggle for the nation to become a great nation with black people making powerful contributions to the building of that kind of nation.
On January 31st, 1865, with the war's end in sight, the U.S. Congress passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in all of the United States. Douglas, at 47 years old, had witnessed his people's journey from bondage to freedom. As the nation recovered from its most costly war, he again seized the moment to deliver a lesson for the hour.
The hour is one of hope as well as danger. But whatever comes to pass, one thing is clear: the necessities of both sections of the country and every suggestion of enlightened policy demand the enfranchisement of the entire colored population of the country. I end where I began. No war but an abolition war. No peace but an abolition peace.
Frederick Douglass, When the Lion Wrote History, will return in a moment. This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service.
To order a video cassette of Frederick Douglass, When the Lion Wrote History, call PBS Video at 1-800-828-4PBS or write to the address on the screen.
Almost a third of those engaged, 51,000 men, were lost. As the rebels staggered back, Lee rode out to meet them. "All this has been my fault," he told them.
It was an incredible mistake, and there's scarcely a trained soldier who didn't know it was a mistake.
Lee's army would never again penetrate so far into Northern Territory.
Major funding for this program has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
The old plantation, but he had nothing but the dusty road under his feet. He was free from the old quarter that once gave him shelter, but a slave to the rains of summer and the frost of winter. He was, in a word, literally turned loose, naked, hungry, and destitute to the open sky.
At the end of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass saw 4 million slaves liberated from bondage and now hoped for full citizenship for all black people. Instead, he saw former Confederate leaders immediately enact black codes, laws that prohibited blacks from owning land or firearms. In many communities, blacks without work could be charged with vagrancy and forced back into the equivalent of unpaid slave labor.
At this critical moment, Garrison announced that the fight was over, called for the disbanding of the anti-slavery organization. Douglass and Wendell Phillips took up the fight and continued it. He said, we freed the slaves, but we have not freed African Americans or black people.
What was critical for him was not just to be proclaimed free or legislated free, but how could our freedom be so organized that we would be able to make use of that freedom to change our situation and to change the situation of the society. The vote was central to this. Gaining the vote, that became critical to everything that he began to do.
He thought if you give black people the vote in the South, they will have power, and they will have sheriffs, and they will be able to protect themselves.
All across the South, night riders were terrorizing the freed people. They organized into the White Leagues, the Knights of the White Camellia, and the Ku Klux Klan in order to enforce white supremacy and keep black people from the vote.
Without this, his liberty is a mockery. For in fact, he holds his liberty as a privilege, not as a right. He is at the mercy of the mob and has no means of protecting himself.
In the past, the women's movement had been Douglass's strong ally in the fight to end slavery, but many refused to join him in the new fight for black suffrage. They felt any constitutional amendment expanding suffrage should include women.
Black abolitionists, led by Douglass, were saying, let's go for what we can get. This is the Negro's hour. We need black male suffrage because black men, he said, black people, are the ones who are being beaten and strung up and really suffering all this violence. And white women are not subject to that kind of violence.
In 1866, Douglass led a delegation that met with President Andrew Johnson. They hoped to gain the president's support for black suffrage, but Johnson refused, saying that if black people voted, there would be race wars. A year later, Douglass's Republican allies in Congress declared a radical reconstruction of the South. They divided the region into 5 military districts, sent in federal troops, and demanded that Southern states ratify the 15th Amendment in exchange for being readmitted into the Union. In 1870, the 15th Amendment became law, stating that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race.
At that point, there were, huge celebrations held all over the country. The old abolitionists said, this is it, our dream has come true. Some people said then, and the quote is accurate, freedom has been established. There are no more colored people in the United States of America.
The new voters elected 2 black men to the U.S. Senate, 16 to Congress, and over 600 to state legislatures during the period of Reconstruction. But across the country, there was growing resistance to black political leadership. On the night of June 2nd, 1872, Frederick Douglass's own home was burned to the ground.
He was actually in Washington when the fire broke out in the house, and he rushed back to Rochester and said straight out right away that it was arson, and nobody denied that it was.
His first night back in Rochester, Douglas was refused a room at the Congress Hall Hotel, evidence of what he called the Ku Klux spirit.
It is a spirit of hate, a spirit of murder, a spirit which would burn a family in their beds. I may be wrong, but I fear that sentiment which repelled me at Congress Hall burnt my house.
No arsonist was ever found, but it seems quite likely that someone torched the house. The family managed to get out, but they did not get a lot of things out of it, including a complete run of the North Star, which was lost in that fire. And I've always felt that in a certain sense Douglas became an old man with that fire.
After almost 25 years in Rochester, Douglas and his family moved to Washington, D.C. Now in the center of political life, he campaigned vigorously for the re-election of President Ulysses S. Grant and called for the Republican Party to maintain its commitment to the progress made by black people since the Civil War.
What he continued to remind people about was that black men had gained a claim on the future of the society and on their own future and on their own freedom by participating in the Civil War.
He was genuinely upset at the building of monuments to Confederate soldiers, and when blue-gray reunions, the mixing of Northern and Southern veterans at reunions began to occur in the 1870s and 80s, Douglas resented this. Douglas saw that somehow the country was beginning to move toward reunion and sectional reconciliation, but he saw that it was happening at the expense of any kind of racial reconciliation.
For his children's generation, because of the enormous discrimination that they faced, the boys became tradesmen. They were printers, apprenticed as printers, and taught the printer's trade. They could not become gentlemen.
Day after day, week after week, month after month, my son sought work, found none, and came home sad and dejected. I had felt the iron of Negro hate before, but the case of this young man gave it a deeper entrance into my soul than before. Here was my son, who had learned his trade in my office, a young man of good character, and yet unable to find work at his trade because of his color and race.
Douglas delivered the keynote speech at the unveiling of the Freedmen's Monument in the spring of 1876. With President Grant and members of Congress and the Supreme Court in attendance, Douglas paid tribute to Lincoln. But at the same time, he reminded his audience that preserving the Union had meant more to Abraham Lincoln than the freedom of slaves.
Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Knowing this, I concede to you, my white fellow citizens, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme. First, midst, and last, you were the objects of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity.
Douglas said that Lincoln was neither our man nor our model, that he was entirely devoted to the interests of white people. He was entirely the white man's president, and that we needed another model, another image to sustain us in our attempt to transform America, to transform the foundations of American institutions, and to create not an old union, but a new union of blacks and whites and freed people of all colors and conditions.
In 1878, Douglas moved to a 20-room house on a 9-acre farm in Anacostia in the District of Columbia. He adorned the walls with pictures of his family and abolitionist friends, and in the parlor met with leading politicians and activists of the day. In his years on the lecture circuit, Douglas had traveled the country speaking on the theme of the self-made man. Cedar Hill was a clear reminder of how far he had come.
Douglas received unprecedented honors for a black man in the United States of America. He received a major federal post. He was in demand on the lecture circuit. He was celebrated everywhere. Everybody wanted to get his opinions.
Presidents would appoint him to particular tasks and responsibilities. This kind of honor, as he understood it, being placed upon him, was for him an honor for his people as well. And that tie was always there with Douglas, so he was representative man.
Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes had appointed Douglas the U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia. But a month later, Hayes began withdrawing federal troops from the South, reversing the policy of protecting black civil rights. The move marked the end of Reconstruction.
This country was not prepared to recognize the possibility that those it had claimed were slaves and could be nothing else but slaves actually had within themselves the capacity to become co-creators of a new society.
America was tired of black people, tired of the black question. They wanted to reunite the northern and southern markets. They wanted to get on with making money. They wanted to get on with doing business.
More than a decade after the war, many former slaves remained trapped in economic bondage, working land owned by others for no real wages. State and local governments offered little protection to black people against organized vigilantes determined to restore white supremacy.
It was a revolutionary Southwide white resistance movement, a violent movement, in which there were massacres, people were shot down, and every tactic was used to keep black people from the ballot. Ordinary black people said this is enough and organized to flee the South and to go to Kansas and to go to Illinois and other states where their women would not be whipped and their children shot down.
They were called exodusters, 50,000, most of them desperately poor, heading north to Kansas and neighboring states.
Douglas was very much embarrassed by this movement because he didn't like the idea of black action being dependent on charity, and he didn't like the idea of this helter-skelter, leaderless movement. So Douglas said in public that the exodusters shouldn't try to get away, that they should demand their rights where they were.
The South is the best place for the Negro. Nowhere else is there for him a promise of a happier future. Let him stay there if he can and save both the South and himself to civilization.
He was actually booed by black audiences who were in support of the exodusters, black audiences who realized how desperate the condition of black Southerners could be.
The consensus of opinion is that during this period, he was a little removed from what was happening to black people in the South, and that during this period, he lost touch somewhat.
He was also much older. This is the end of a life of struggle that had gone on for 40-some years. Douglas had been out speaking and talking and raising money and agitating. He'd been at it for a very long time. And when he saw this movement, he thought he was seeing the failure of what he had stood for all those 40 years.
Self-made men are men who are what they are, without the aid of any of the favoring conditions by which other men usually rise in the world and achieve great results. If they traveled far, they have made the road on which they traveled. If they ascended high, they have built their own ladder.
There also was the familiar and attractive idea of racial uplift, that black people, and in this sense it's primarily black men, could make themselves, could lift themselves from this slough of degradation of slavery and post-slavery.
He was saying to his people, we must do it and we can do it. And I am testimony to the fact that in spite of where we have been in the past, in spite of what's been done to us in the past, we have within ourselves the capacity to overcome.
Now known as the Sage of Anacostia, in his early 60s, Douglass sat down to write his life story for the third time, reminding the nation that slavery and its legacy was an indelible part of the American experience. Once again, Douglass began his story at his birth.
When one has advanced far in the journey of life, when he has seen and traveled over much of this great world and has had many and strange experiences of shadow and sunshine, when long distances of time and space have come between him and his point of departure, it is natural that his thoughts should turn to the place of his beginning.
Douglass had met his wife while he was still a slave, and now Anna was suffering with illness.
Douglass had continuing tension in his family, and yet he continued to struggle. His wife died, who had stood by him all these years of his resistance and liberation and struggle. It had to be a tremendous blow.
Well, Douglass is crushed by the death of Anna, and that left him prostrate. And he said so. He wrote about it. And he was in a state in which he didn't quite know which way to turn. He was lost. He was a man who all of his adult life had had this woman to depend on.
When death comes into one's home, a home of 44 years, it brings with it a lesson of thought, silence, humility, and resignation. Mother was the post in the center of my house and held us together.
After a period of mourning, in 1884, Douglass married Helen Pitts. She was a Mount Holyoke Seminary graduate and a women's rights activist. She was 20 years his junior, and she was white.
It was an enormously controversial marriage. There was this revival of white supremacy, of indeed a kind of scientific racism by the 1880s. This is the most famous black man in America who marries a white woman in the America that was now becoming increasingly Jim Crow.
That caused an uproar, and a number of people criticized him for it, and caused some internal problems in his family.
Rosetta was bitterly resentful of her father doing this, and she was also troubled that her stepmother was a white woman. And there was a great hue and cry about this from both black and white segments of the American public.
You will be glad to know that my marriage has not diminished the number of invitations I used to receive for lectures and speeches. There is one matter upon which I wish you as an old and dear friend to be entirely satisfied, and that is that Helen and I are making life go very happily, and that neither of us has yet repented of our marriage.
The couple traveled through Europe and North Africa. In 1889, Douglass was appointed the U.S. Minister to the Black Republic of Haiti. During his term, he was in conflict with U.S. policies in the region, and after 2 years, resigned. When he returned to the States, the newspaper editor Ida B. Wells asked Douglas to join her in speaking out against the lynching of blacks in America.
She needed every ally she could get, and certainly one of the allies she wanted was the old war horse Frederick Douglass.
It was a moment for him to recapture that fervor of his youth, of becoming someone who's out in front and who's demanding change and who's awakening the American opinion to evils that need to be challenged. And in that sense, Ida B. Wells gave him another life.
There is nothing in the history of savages to suppress the blood-chilling horrors and fiendish excesses perpetrated against the colored people by the so-called enlightened and Christian people of the South. Let the white people of the North and South conquer their prejudices. Let them give up the idea that to degrade the colored man is to elevate the white man.
This was one of the worst decades in the history of black people in this country. Lynching everywhere. Almost every day that somebody was lynched. Jim Crow laws were multiplying. They were talking about dividing cities into black and white areas, and there seemed to be no hope for black people anywhere. And Douglas said in that period, in 1894-95, and he speaks to young blacks particularly today. He said, do not lose hope. Continue to struggle. Things look bad today, but time will fight our battles. Every day our numbers grow. These will speak for us.
He died at Cedar Hill from having been to a women's rights meeting that morning. He died having regained his voice. He died having said loudly and clearly that there was another wrong in this country that had to be righted.
What made him face each day was a belief that all he had struggled for was someday going to pass, and that African Americans at some point in their long chronicle were going to achieve equality. And he could believe that because he had seen how far they had come. He had seen how far he had come.
Now, what the real problem is, we all ought to know. It is not a Negro problem, but in every sense a great national problem. It involves the question whether, after all, our boasted civilization, our Declaration of Independence, our matchless Constitution, our sublime Christianity, our wise statesmanship, we as a people possess virtue enough to solve this problem in accordance with wisdom and justice and to the advantage of both races.
Though only 20 million people actually voted for H. Ross Perot in 1992, his supporters have joined with others to form a new coalition of socially tolerant, fiscally conservative citizens. Watch the new Militant Center next to 10:30 here on OPB.